Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to your morning briefing for Thursday, 6th of March, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway with Robert here. Good morning, Robert. Let's take a look here at these national injunctions. So we've previously talked about this during the first Trump term. Republicans, the Trump administration, started talking about how do we limit the disruption caused by an injunction issued by a lower federal court. And one thing they talked about is limiting the injunction to just that judge's injunction. So if the opposition wanted a national injunction, they would have to file lawsuits and get these injunctions in every district. The House GOP now is advancing a bill to curb these national injunctions. So what's their plan now?
Yesterday, the House Judiciary Committee, they voted to push out both what they're calling the No Rogue Rulings Act and also the Judges Act we've covered previously out to the House floor. And this No Rogue Rulings Act would block these lower federal courts from issuing these nationwide injunctions or rulings blocking national level policies. And while I don't expect that this will sail through the Senate due to the need for Democratic votes, I think this is a signal from the House GOP and Republican Party for these lower federal courts to back off on these very expansive temporary restraining orders and these nationwide injunctions.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then coming up in the House, or excuse me, in the Senate today, there's a defense mobilization in the 21st century. We'll monitor that, and if there's anything we need to report, we'll let you know in tomorrow's briefing. All right, Robert, let's move now to this state level lawfare thing. What's going on?
So during the House hearing on the state level lawfare, a South Carolina Republican named Russell Fry, he introduced what he's calling the Promptly Ending Political Prosecutions and Executive Retaliation Act of 2025. And basically, this would allow sitting and former presidents and vice presidents to force state level courts to move their any kind of state level prosecution or civil case up to the federal courts. It would also codify federal immunity for official acts of any federal officers. And he said that this would bar politically motivated state prosecutions of federal officials. I think bottom line up front, the Republican Party is moving to shield the current Trump administration from some level of lawfare against officials now and then in the future after Trump leaves office, especially at the state level. And while I think this bill could pass the Senate, if Republicans can convince at least 7 Senate Democrats to cross the aisle, which they're trying to do by arguing that this would be a bipartisan protection for both a Republican or Democratic president and administration. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's likely to pass right now. The other option, Republicans could use what's called the nuclear option to kill the Senate legislative filibuster and pass it with a simple majority.
Mm-hmm. All right. So the argument would be a Democrat president would be protected, or not protected, but a state level lawsuit against the president could be elevated to a federal court, and therefore slightly more advantageous for that president or for that politician?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Let's move on now to our next items here. Go ahead, Robert.
So yesterday, House Taxation Committee Chair Jason Smith, he's a Missouri Republican, he said that the debt ceiling could be breached earlier than expected, as early as May, if the U.S. government does not collect as much tax revenue as previously expected this year. Before Jason Smith said this, we've seen a lot of finance and economic analysts saying that the U.S. is expected to hit the debt ceiling sometime during the summer between July and August. And the Trump administration is tapping former Morgan Stanley banker Michael Grimes to lead a planned sovereign wealth fund. This was an idea that President Trump proposed during the 2024 campaign. And the idea would be taking the tariff revenue from these tariffs being levied to invest in manufacturing hubs, defense and medical research. And from what I've seen, there are some people that say they're familiar with these plans, that the Commerce Department is considering pairing this planned sovereign wealth fund with the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation and the Export-Import Bank. And the idea is to focus investments on national security priorities, especially areas where the federal government sees China as having like market dominance. I think they specifically said stuff like critical minerals and technology.
Mm-hmm. And so, Robert, this sovereign wealth fund, the plan. One thing I remember reporting on back in probably 2015, 2016, the Chinese government was pushing money into AI development. And at the time, we were talking about the United States really didn't have a plan like that for taxpayer money to be pushed into AI development for obvious reasons. But this seems to be a way for the federal government to be able to direct certain investment towards these national security priority industries.
Correct. And the Trump administration has really been ramping up the national security justification for a lot of moves like this, like standing up the sovereign wealth fund, some of the things with CFIUS on blocking certain foreign investments. And yeah, I think this is another part of a trend where a lot more economic policy is going to be put under national security concerns.
All right. That makes sense. All right. There is an auto tariff reprieve coming, according to the Trump administration. What's going on?
President Trump said he's going to exempt automakers from these 25% blanket tariffs on Canadian and Mexican imports for at least 1 month. And this exemption is supposed to apply to both completed manufactured vehicles and auto parts. And I think the auto parts section of this exemption is actually probably more important than the complete vehicle exemption, because as we said before, the auto industry says like 80% of their parts come from Canada and Mexico. And the Trump administration is also looking at some type of tariff carve-outs for the agricultural industry as well. And they didn't give specific examples, but Rawlins, who's the agriculture secretary, did mention things like fertilizer and potash.
Mm-hmm. All right, moving on. The greater Nashville area has just been booming. Lots of people moving to Nashville. And it's gotten so bad that grid operators were concerned about potential electricity shortages there. Apparently, TVA is announcing a new project for 7 gigawatts.
Yeah, this is a lot of energy. They're saying they're going to invest $16 billion, and this is primarily going to be through liquid natural gas power plants. 7 gigawatts is about enough to power 4 million homes. So you're talking a decent sized city that this power project could power. They also said they're developing small modular nuclear reactors at the Clinch River nuclear site. But as we've said before, I think it was a lot of the sentiment in the power industry is that these small modular reactors are not really viable right now and won't be for at least another decade.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's bring Jared on. Jared, one of the things we've heard is that the United States now, at least allegedly, is not providing intelligence to Ukraine. And this has created a position where France is apparently now stepping up and providing their own intelligence. What's going on?
Yes. So couldn't get confirmation on whether or not the U.S. had been or had therefore ceased it. But the French defense minister said this morning, yes, we are going to provide military intelligence to Ukraine to cover down for what the U.S. has stopped. And this is particularly important given an announcement yesterday from French President Macron, where he said he would begin discussing extending the French nuclear umbrella to the rest of Europe with his European counterparts. So that's a pretty significant escalation. And if I remember right, by Russia's view, this providing military intelligence for targeting will effectively make France a belligerent in the war.
Mm-hmm. Hey, on that topic, let's take a question here. This is the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has openly stated that putting NATO troops in Ukraine is a red line. Do you think this is posturing? Jared, Sergei Lavrov doesn't really get to make the rules for Russia. And putting boots on ground, everything that I have seen would be part of a ceasefire or part of a peace deal. Essentially, you would have NATO countries maybe acting unilaterally and securing critical infrastructure, et cetera. This is going to be worked out in a potential peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. But I don't see this as a trigger for like World War III. What's your take on it?
If it's post-war, I don't think so either. The statement was actually made as in, hey, providing troops to Ukraine as is, which, yes, that is a red line. That's been a stated red line for a couple of years now. Mm-hmm. I did see one interesting piece that could potentially cross that without crossing it. Turkey is open to it, but waiting for any kind of possible request. And being that they're a bit more friendly with Russia, it's a maybe, but they are still NATO, so that would actually be crossing that line. That I do want to see that go a lot further and be discussed before we dive into all that.
Mm-hmm. Erdogan has come out and I'm pretty sure he publicly castigated Putin and basically saying it was a mistake and Putin violated international law or whatever to invade Ukraine. I don't know. I see people in the chat saying Russia will never go for NATO troops in Ukraine. Certainly during wartime, in a peacetime deal, listen, at this point, that seems more likely to be between Trump and Putin. So
Absolutely.
We'll see. All right, let's move on here to Mexico. Jared.
Yes, the Mexican Economy Ministry opened an investigation into Chinese steel to determine if China was dumping steel into Mexico throughout 2024. It was from September of 23 to basically the end of 24. And the previous dumping investigation, which they just finished into Chinese rubber products, they determined that China had been doing that and actually created a threat to Mexico's national rubber industry. So I do expect this to go forward. And all of this is, of course, going to play into Mexican tariffs from the United States, how we treat that entire relationship, and looking further down the road, how the USMCA is going to be renegotiated next year.
Mm-hmm. Jared, you previously reported that the Trump administration is pushing Mexico to implement certain tariffs on China. This seems to be building justification to do that.
Absolutely. I think it's fair to say it's a legal prerequisite. You have to determine that there's a grievance against you, and then you say, fine, we will absolutely stop you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Great. Thanks for that, Jared. Let's move on now to today's warning items. Starting with DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. I was reading through a blog post this morning, and DSA claims that the party has grown by more than 7,000 members through January. So conceivably, this could be like 10,000 members following the 2024 election. 7,000 members would represent about 10% increase in the total party membership, somewhere around there. This blog post also mentioned that 40% of this new membership came from the greater New York area. Now, this builds on something that we have previously discussed, which is this break of the liberal left alliance in the Democratic Party, because you have these DSA caucus leaders pushing for what they're calling a dirty break from the Democratic Party. And so one of the strategies that's being laid out that's going to be discussed at this year's national committee conference at DSA is this plan to run 10 congressional candidates, not as Democrats, because what ends up happening is you have these Democratic candidates running for Congress, and some of them are backed by the DSA, either endorsed by the national or municipal parties. And what they're talking about is no longer running DSA-backed candidates as Democrats, but rather running them as DSA party members. And so this is going to greatly complicate some political strategies in areas where these DSA candidates have been pretty popular. AOC, for example, is one of the DSA candidates or DSA-backed candidates. Cori Bush, who is no longer a member of Congress, but Jamal Bowman, no longer a member of Congress. But Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, those are all at some level DSA-supported candidates, and they still are in Congress. So part of the strategy, again, is to run 10 congressional candidates in order to, what they say, wage a successful intervention in the midterms next year, and then break off the left wing from the Democrat Party. The article further describes the need to capitalize on this growth momentum, and they say that 2025 is going to be the year of party building, and they're going to focus on growing recruitment and organizing efforts ahead of the 2026 midterms. So one of the things that we have discussed is this potential realignment of the Democratic Party. And this article says that essentially Democratic Socialists within the Democratic Party represented a dead end. And so this is consistent with previous reporting. Activists are pushing for this dirty break at the upcoming DSA National Convention this year. And ultimately, they want to launch I guess maybe relaunch DSA, maybe even launch an explicitly Marxist political party in 2027. And that is in preparation for the 2028 elections. I think left-wing parties are almost certainly one financial crisis or recession away from having a new generation of leaders. And I think the precedent here would be we can look at Bernie Sanders' run as a presidential candidate back in 2016. That spurred a huge groundwell of support for socialism. And I remember seeing it on social media, all these videos about young people coming out for Bernie Sanders and endorsing Bernie Sanders. If we do have a financial crisis or recession prior to the midterms, at least prior to 2028, we will probably see a resurgence of this support for socialism, especially if the socialists run a political candidate on an anti-capitalist platform. I think that seems to be the most likely trigger heading into the 2028 elections. And it's going to be pretty interesting to see if there is a groundswell for support for, say, a DSA-backed candidate in some states where that third party could take 1.35% of the electorate. We could have in some of these states, maybe a real three-way race between socialists, the moderate Democrats, if they do end up moderating their position and going back to a center-left party, and Republicans. All right, let's move on to the next item here. Robert, this was all over the news yesterday, but the Supreme Court came out and ruled in favor of this lower court against the Trump administration. What's going on?
Yeah, yesterday the Supreme Court declined to take up the Trump administration's emergency appeal on this $2 billion funding freeze at the USAID. But I think it's important to point out that the order did not side necessarily with the district court. Rather, they told the district court hey, you need to clean up your procedure. You need to be more specific about what out of this $2 billion needs to be paid. And I think that the Supreme Court is attempting to do two things. One, they're trying to rein in the district court's expansion of these temporary restraining orders, which are not supposed to be used in some of the ways the district courts are using them. And they're also trying to avoid setting a precedent for emergency appeals of these restraining orders, because that would end up flooding the court with even more cases, even more emergency cases. Interestingly, the dissenting opinion from Alito, Gorsuch, Thomas, and Kavanaugh, I think, is providing a political opening for Trump to openly defy the courts in the future, because they said that the district courts should not have the jurisdiction or power to compel the federal government to spend money. I've also seen where there are some legal analysts that I pay attention to that have said that Chief Justice Roberts is actually primarily concerned around these cases with keeping what's called the regular order of the courts. They want these cases to move through the trial and appeals courts of the districts before they get to the Supreme Court. And this is not necessarily a sign that the Supreme Court is ultimately going to side against the Trump administration.
Okay. So one argument that I saw was that Amy Coney Barrett and Roberts were basically saying in their ruling, siding with the liberal justices, they were saying that the United States, the State Department was essentially contractually obligated, and so that's why they didn't side with the dissenting opinion. So bottom line here, Robert, is this a case where the Supreme Court could rule again in favor of the Trump administration and basically say lower courts do not have the jurisdiction to stop the executive branch?
Yeah, eventually, once it works its way through the entire federal court system, the Supreme Court could side with the Trump administration. And I think that if they decide not to, though, that this dissenting opinion is going to be very influential for how the Trump administration opposes the courts in that eventuality.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that seemed to be I don't know, Democrats, at least the opposition at least, would say that's a breach of authority in a constitutional crisis. And maybe we could see them try to build a protest movement around that. And still, they are searching for something. Someone just posted a video the other day of maybe 30 or 40, maybe 50 max people protesting outside the White House. And the reality is that is really about as much protest movement as we have seen so far. A lot of these protests are in the dozens. We've seen a couple in the low thousands, but all this to say they are really struggling trying to gain traction to build a protest movement here. All right, thanks for that, Robert. Let's move on now. Jared, let's talk about gray zone warfare here, because there's this international law professor who's pushing the United States to treat Chinese gray zone warfare as legitimate acts of conventional war.
Not just the United States, but he's telling his Japanese counterparts to do so as well. And he is the chair of the Stockton Center for International Law at the U.S. Naval War College, so he's going to be pretty influential on how doctrine even works for the Navy. Now, Professor Kraska, the gentleman in question, recommended to its Japanese counterparts that, yes, hey, start treating it in the way that we do, which is to say that any attack on your unit can be defended against. I lost it. Okay. Anyway, he was citing two different rulings from the International Court of Justice, basically saying, hey, this is an invalid ruling. The U.S. doesn't recognize it. We never signed on to it. You should do the same thing and just ignore those rulings. Treat this as international law. And then he specifically cited a case of gray zone warfare lighting off sonar near divers, which we covered in 24, where Chinese ships lit off sonar near Australian divers. He called out that exact situation, said, yes, that should have been a trigger for war. So,
and it should have been a trigger for war because that could
kill the
grievous
diver.
injury or lethal. Okay.
Yep. Now, obviously, this significantly lowers the threshold of war if it goes forward. It basically everything that we've covered here at Forward Observer and Early Warning, most of those would have risen to the level of war if this is implemented. I think right now it remains unlikely to go forward with Japan because Japan holds the ICJ presidency. However, we could see them say, hey, yes, there's a way to do both. And I think this does offer an opportunity for a reinterpretation of international law in order to really loosen the restrictions on America's allies, specifically the Philippines, because they've seen the greatest number of gray zone warfare tactics with rammings and the guy losing his thumb and buzzing helicopters. Almost all of those could potentially rise to the level of war if they do take on the doctrine that America endorses now.
Mm-hmm. I've seen for years U.S. defense analysts and China watchers say that China runs. If you look at the spectrum of cooperation, crisis, and cooperation, competition, crisis, and conflict, China runs. If conflict is 3, China runs pretty consistently at about a 2.75. So they are just skirting that line of definitely not being a conventional war, but operating well within that crisis zone, causing problems and dilemmas for the United States and allies in the Indo-Pacific. Is there any indication, Robert, that this change of command at the Defense Department is going to look at Chinese gray zone warfare as anything more than just causing crisis?
I have not seen any indication that they would. It entirely, and looking historically, I don't know if we could get a good read on that. It depends on what they have personally been reading and how they're feeling about, is China conducting warfare without conducting warfare?
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, they sure seem to be. All right. Thanks for that. And then speaking of war, let's move on to this Hong Kong shippers. What's going on?
Yes, this was pretty incredible to read. So this is coming directly from Hong Kong media. Hong Kong media conducted several interviews with shipping company executives over there, and all of those executives revealed to them in private that they are reflagging their vessels and moving operations out of Hong Kong. And the reason they're doing that is they're afraid China would seize their ships in the event of a war, and the U.S. would level sanctions on all of these companies, effectively having a material and an economic destruction of their companies. Now, Hong Kong, as you can see on the graph here, which this is about right for even 2025 now. Hong Kong is the fourth most used flag for shipping companies in the world. This could significantly degrade China's logistics footprint for war and peace, basically undercutting a lot of what has been talked about, even at the national stage with Trump during his speech. He was talking about, oh yeah, China controls a ton of the shipping. We need to get more shipping. Well, this would significantly undercut that, and there is potential here for this to actually even have an outsized effect if these companies reflag to American flags or they put their ships over here instead. It does offer a pretty rapid buildup of American ships and the shipping fleet if they decide to come over here. And I do expect there are probably behind the scenes, offers of, hey, you can come reflag, just come over to San Diego, come over to Portland. We need you. Now, the fear that China would seize their ships, those are well-founded fears because as far back as 2015, the Chinese state ordered all Chinese shipbuilders to make their commercial vessels dual use. So the entire Chinese shipping fleet made in the last 10 years should be understood as a military asset as well. Additionally, COSCO, China's state shipping company, they have started placing political commissars onto ships in order to, affect the will of the Communist Party, and that is actually pretty much a direct copy of what you see in the business world, but also in the military world. For the PLAN, you have your military leaders, but you also have your political commissars. So they're building the infrastructure there already, and these shipping companies understand that, and they're trying to move out.
Mm-hmm. That is very interesting. Now, Jared, when you say that commercial shipping vessels should be viewed maybe as having military capabilities, it's not exactly what you said. But are they talking about the ability to put containerized missiles on these civilian commercial shipping vessels?
Some of these would be containerized vessels because they're container ships and bulk carriers, but it did also include tankers. So I think that's going to be, having the ability to suddenly be a refueler instead of just carrying natural gas. Probably isn't a great example, but if you're carrying JP5 or whatever the Chinese equivalent is to refuel ships, you can hook up and actually refuel ships at sea. Most of these would have basically just logistics applications for military, not offensive capabilities. But this also makes them all legitimate targets in the event of a war.
Jared, is it safe to say that if a commercial cargo ship is reflagging away from Hong Kong to Panama or Liberia, that's no longer a PLAN affiliated shipping vessel?
I think they would also have to re-home port, which that was another large thing mentioned, is that for quite some time, people have been moving out of Hong Kong. The operations is enormous, but the ownership via the flag is kind of just saying it's basically giving the deed. So if you change the deed, but you're still running in Hong Kong, they can still seize you. Moving out of Hong Kong is making sure that there is no claim at all. Singapore has been a pretty significant destination for it, but it's still fairly close. Moving over to Panama, Liberia, that would be basically taking it out of the Chinese hands.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. Very interesting. And let's go ahead and get to some of your questions today. We already got to one earlier. Oh, let's see. Oh, we may not have any questions. All right, here you go. Jared, even if they reflag, would you trust which side they would be on in a conflict? Seems like they would be putting everything, including extended family, at risk. I guess the question is, if you have a PLAN affiliated ship, so basically a commercial carrier that is militarized or has some sort of military application, and they reflag to Panama, would that necessarily mean that that's now a neutral ship if they reflag to a foreign country?
I think it's fair to say it would be neutral, and more to the heart of the question, we don't have to worry about which side it's on, because we just need them to be mercenary and appeal to their own interests, not to either interest. We want neutrality. We don't want alliance necessarily.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Jared. Next question comes from Ben. Robert, just some clarification here. So was that ruling rooted in contract law or in saying that I guess they didn't rule on either. They didn't rule on the contract law. They also didn't rule on jurisdiction. They just said, be more specific with what this is ruling, right?
From what I understand, yeah. And that's what I saw from legal analysts saying that the dissenting opinion is they're talking about this jurisdiction thing, but the actual pushing this back down to the court was basically Robert saying, like, this judge hasn't done anything yet for us to block. Because these orders are just garbage, basically.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's a ruling that the lower court should clarify.
Yeah, and just for context, this is that judge that got his JD in Canada and has only been a judge for like 3 months, and I think has only practiced law in the United States for fewer than 5 years.
Yeah. Amir Ali.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We're going to do some skipping around. Thanks for that, Robert. Jared, we'll do this last question today. Would you interpret these gray zone incidents as an attack and open up to a false flag? Or I'm sorry, would this interpret these gray zone incidents as a potential false flag?
I think in practical terms, yes, it would open to a false flag, but you really don't need to. The Chinese are very open about, like, they acknowledge, yes, we did light off sonar. It was near the diver, and it was correct for us to do so. Yes, we did ram that Philippine ship. Yes, we cut off his thumb, and it was correct for us to do so. There's no reason to run a false flag, because they will just do it. They just don't call it gray zone warfare. They call it deterrence.
Okay. Right. I've noticed that too. Yeah, the Chinese are definitely not bashful about using gray zone tactics. All right. Well, everyone, thanks so much for watching. And thanks to Robert and Jared as always. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show, starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.